Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so pleased to be able to share some thoughts with everyone today about my new book, Bacteria to AI, Our Human Futures with Our Non-Human Symbionts. And this is a large project of which AI is a part, but there are many other parts as well. So it is, in a way, a sequel to my previous book called Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, and it focuses on the idea of cognition. I chose cognition rather than thought or intelligence because those two terms have deep associations with humans in particular, and I wanted a term that would open the discussion to non-human entities, not just to humans, so I chose cognition. Obviously, for this project and also for Unthought, I needed a definition of cognition. So in Unthought, I define cognition as the process of interpreting information in contexts that connect it with meaning. But subsequently, I have expanded this definition of cognition to include 5 crucial behaviors. The first is a cognitive entity has to have the ability to sense information from its environment, interpret that information, respond in flexible and creative ways, be able to anticipate in its behavior, and finally be able to learn. So you put those together, it's SIRAL, SIRAL. And those are the fundamental behaviors that define a cognitive entity. At present, in developed societies, most of the work is done by cognitive assemblages. Those are cognitive entities that are joined together through information flow, interpretation, and actions, and they include humans, of course, but also non-humans and a whole variety of computational media. So in these cognitive assemblages, I make a distinction between agents and actors. So agents, in my view, are material processes upon which all life is based. These would be things like chemical reactions, tectonic flows, and so forth. They have enormous agency. Think of a tornado or a glacier flow, for example, often agency that exceeds whatever humans can do. But what they do not have is the ability to interpret information flows and to respond in a cognitively sensitive way. So a tornado is simply the resultant of all the forces acting upon it. It can't choose to plow through an unoccupied field rather than a town. So that's agents, but on the other hand, there are actors. All life forms, including amoeba and bacteria and fungi and plants, are cognitive entities that have intentions and therefore can be regarded as cognitive entities. And the same is true of computational media. Computational media can be designed so that they have intentions, they have goals, they have purposes, they interpret information from their environments, they act upon that information, and they can anticipate consequences and also learn, especially, of course, artificial intelligence. So these are the kind of fundamentals of my scheme. And my new book, Bacteria to AI, builds upon these ideas to create what it calls an integrated cognitive framework, ICF. So an integrated cognitive framework attempts to place all these cognitive entities in relation to one another. So that would include not only humans, not only mammals, but also non-conscious life forms such as plants and bacteria. And finally, it would also include artificial intelligence and other forms of computational media that have cognitive capacities. Now, what's the point of building this integrated cognitive framework? Well, its basic purpose is to combat anthropocentrism. And here I contrast anthropocentrism with anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is inevitable because we're humans, we think as humans, we see as humans, we perceive as humans. But anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are superior to all other life forms and humans have the deciding voice in all decisions, needs to be combated because it has become a dangerous illusion, in fact, threatening us and every other entity on the earth with planet level risks. So by relationizing human cognition and putting it in relation to other cognitive entities, it's somewhat dethroned and decentralized. Not only that, cognition itself has been shown to be not only linked to consciousness, which of course it is, but also to have important implicit and non-conscious cognitive elements. In fact, most of what we do on a daily basis is non-conscious cognition. Driving a car once you've learned to drive, for example, riding a bicycle, walking. Those are all activities that we don't consciously need to focus on, but nevertheless require cognitive responses, which are handled by non-conscious cognition. So neuroscientists and cognitive scientists have estimated that most of our daily activities occur through non-conscious and implicit cognition, leaving consciousness free to speculate on that tiny spectrum in the entire spectrum of cognition that we call conscious awareness. So these are some of the elements of the book and some of the fundamental terms. And here I'll try to expound on some of these ideas and talk about their implications in conversation with Audrey. So Audrey, please join me.
Thank you so much for that. That's really fascinating. And I have had the pleasure of being able to read the first chapter of your book, which is really, really fascinating. I mean, you offer what you offer in continuation with other cognitive revolutions in the 20th century. Do you think that the cognitive revolution we are experiencing today is unprecedented? That's a debate that crops up regularly, and it seems that the jury is still out on that question.
Well, I have many colleagues who like to say there's nothing new under the sun, and everything that happens has already happened before, and they are awfully deeply versed in history and can talk about the Greek philosophers and so on and so forth. But I'm of the opposite persuasion. I'm one of those people who like to focus on what is new and unprecedented. And in my view, there is absolutely no question that the computational media landscape we have developed today is unprecedented in human history. And the development of advanced AI is also unprecedented in human history. Never before have we been able to talk in natural languages with artificial entities the way that we can now. Never before have we had the kind of deep infrastructure and communication networks that we have as a result of computational media. So I think we are in uncharted waters.
Thank you for that. Yes. I mean, I'd like to say, I mean, there is a lot of literature on AI, and actually yours sounds, I don't want to say optimistic, but slightly refreshing in the sense that it's not completely dystopian or pessimistic. And especially when I was really struck by your concept of the cognitive assemblages and how you redefine thought for in broader terms to encompass the non-conscious entities. And can you tell us more as to how computational media, how you see computational media fitting in, and what are some of the perceived benefits that you see occurring in these new assemblages?
Well, I come from a discipline, literary studies, that for the past 30 or 40 years has specialized in critique. And critique can be understood as deconstructing the premises of someone's argument, showing its affiliation with all kinds of undesirable practices and so on and so forth. And I respect that tradition. It's done a lot of good in terms of feminist critiques of um, male philosophy and so on and so forth, racial discrimination. And we could add to that list almost indefinitely. But in my view, at present, we are facing such serious crisis, planet level risks, that we need to move beyond critique to some kind of positive contributions. And I think you're right to sense in my writing and indeed in my entire project a desire to make some kind of positive contribution without ignoring or being oblivious to the risks involved, but trying to imagine how we can reach more desirable futures for ourselves and the other inhabitants of this planet. So I am really dedicated to that project, to go beyond critique and to constructive suggestions.
Thank you. I mean, you talk about the very noble idea of relationizing human relations, but I wonder, when we're dealing with these various entities and these cognitive assemblages, all of these cognitions and forms of communications, are they all commensurable? Do you think,
No,
how
no.
does that work, do you think?
Well, to put something in relation is not to really make them commensurable. It's also to point out all the differences. So relation is not only about similarity, it's also crucially about differences. So there are enormous differences between the kinds of cognitions that other biological life forms have compared to us. There are also enormous differences between our forms of cognition and computational media. So to just in very brief terms point this out, our sensory universe is constituted through our specifically human sensory and cognitive capabilities, but other species have completely different forms of perceiving the world. So Jakob von Uexküll summarized this decades ago with his term Umwelt, which basically could be translated as world horizon. And he argued that each species has its specific Umwelt. These Umwelten can overlap with each other, but each is distinct. So say you're taking your dog for a walk, you're perceiving through your Umwelt, the dog's perceiving through its Umwelt. There is an overlap, but there are also significant differences. Your dog can hear frequencies you can't. He can smell far more smells than you can. So each species has its own Umwelt. And when we put them in relation, we're not ignoring or papering over those differences. We're trying to be specific about what those differences are. And as Thomas Nagel pointed out in his famous article, What is it like to be a bat? There's always a distinction between knowing about another entity's Umwelt and experiencing as an Umwelt. So we can know a lot about a bat's Umwelt, but we can never experience it because our own Umwelt is the human Umwelt. So we have that distinction between experiencing as abstract knowledge and experiencing as someone interior to that Umwelt. So now if we go to AI, AI has a completely different Umwelt of its own that overlaps with, but is quite distinct from the human Umwelt. And at present, if we look at large language models like OpenAI's GPTs, their Umwelt is comprised entirely of verbal and visual texts. They have no embodied knowledge of the world at all. They don't have a model of the world. They only have a model of language. So that makes its Umwelt significantly different from the human Umwelt. It overlaps because we can both use language, but the way that it understands language is fundamentally different from the way humans understand language, because our understanding of language is completely entangled with our embedded and embodied knowledge of the world. That makes it different from the kind of knowledge that an AI can have.
No, fascinating, fascinating. I mean, and then leaping from that, your book is entitled Human Futures with Non-Human Symbionts. Can you tell us more about how you think, you envisage, you anticipate what those human futures are going to look like?
Well, that's the last chapter of my book. And I use The Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson to explore some of those, perhaps in his case, excessively optimistic scenarios of how we could use all of our computational systems, not only AI, to combat the climate crises we're involved in, to equalize or make more equitable our financial systems, and so on and so forth. So to start, we have to recognize that computational media are now our symbionts. We are involved in deep symbiotic relationships with computational media. So this symbiosis, of course, is a term from biology, when two life forms merge their lives to varying extent. And this could be something like the cattle egret that picks off the bugs on a cow. That's one form of symbiosis, to the kind of microflora biome that enables us to digest our food. There, the symbiosis has progressed so far that we are completely dependent for our existence on those bacteria, just as they're dependent for us for their existence. So symbiosis is a spectrum that can go all the way from occasionally I interact with you to I am absolutely interdependent with you. I cannot live without you. And now in developed societies, we could not live without the computational media infrastructures we've constructed. So what is the present population of the world? It's something like what, 8 billion, 9 billion?
Yeah.
Okay, let's say 9 billion. If all of our computational media were to be destroyed tonight, what percentage of that 9 billion would survive after 6 months? Well, take your pick, but if you live in a city, you're doomed. You couldn't get water, you couldn't get food, you couldn't have any transportation except by walking. So my own guess is something like 10% of the human population of the planet would survive after 6 months. So that indicates the extent of our symbiosis with computational media. It is possible to live without computational media if you live in a tribal society where you're entirely independent of any kind of computational media affordances. So the human population would still continue to exist, but it would be decimated. So most of us would perish in that very dismal scenario. So that is a measure of how deep into symbiosis we have gone. And I anticipate that this is only going to increase in the future. It's not going to decrease. We can't do without our computers without massive loss of life. So that's what I mean by computational media as our symbionts. But of course, there are biological symbionts on which we rely for our existence, as I've already mentioned. And moreover, these are now getting entangled in something like gene editing, for example. So the way that I formulate this in my book is that I focus on 3 first-order emergences: micro, evo for evolutionary biology, and techno for technics. So just very briefly to try to explain this, in the micro realm, Karen Barad has argued that quantum phenomena are co-emergent with the apparatus used to measure them. That whatever we know about the quantum realm is a result of the apparatus used to bring it into our perceptive realm. So it doesn't exist for us except insofar as it can be measured through an apparatus. So in that sense, quantum phenomena are emergent. They're emergent from this interactions between the apparatus and quantum reality, whatever that is. That is, we can't know it directly. We only know it through interacting with it. So it already has us entangled within it when it announces itself to our perceptual realm. Evolutionary biology argues that multicellularity is also an emergent phenomenon. So obviously the first life forms on Earth were unicellular, and it was from interactions between unicellular organisms and unicellular organisms with the environment that multicellularity evolved. So in that sense, multicellularity is an emergent phenomenon. And then finally, in the technical realm, Bernard Stiegler, among others, has argued that humans are the emergent result of interactions between hominids and technics. So by technics, he means the entire world of technical apparatuses, from a flint used to make fire all the way up to a modern computer. And it was when the hominid various species interacted with technical objects that humans came into existence as a species. So in that sense, humans themselves are emergent phenomena. So now we have three cases of originary emergences: micro, evo, techno. But now those three first-order emergences have burst out of their disciplinary boundaries and are interacting with each other to create secondary emergences, second-order emergences. So gene editing would be an example of a second-order emergence, using the cognitive capacities of bacteria along with techniques, along with humans, to create phenomena that were not possible before, such as gene-edited species of various forms. So this, the effect of these second-order emergences has been to accelerate greatly the extent of our symbiosis with techniques, and also the interaction of techniques with every other realm of life. So techniques act as a powerful accelerant, kind of being poured on these first-order emergences now to create this second-order realm of very interactive, very fast, very scary emergences.
Thank you very much for that. To play devil's advocate for a few seconds, cognitive assemblages and what you're saying seems to imply, equal relationships between the various partners in the various entities, but it seems as though AI is taking over. And one question that crops up is, quote unquote, how does the human remain in the loop? Is in the future, in the foreseeable future, are we going to continue being, yes, interdependent and in relationship, or is AI going to completely take over within those assemblages and start reshaping us and start completely remolding us?
Well, that's a great question, Audrey, and I have several things to say about it. First, I don't want to say that the relationships are equal. To say they're relationships is not to say that they're equal. In fact, I don't know on what basis you would even claim equality. we're not equal with the bacteria that digest our food. There are always power relationships involved in this. In some cases, the power goes to the bacteria when we have some intestinal upset. In other cases, the power goes to us when we take an antibiotic and kill off 80% of those bacteria. So power dynamics are pervasive. They're pervasive throughout biological life forms. They're pervasive between biological life forms and computational media. So this idea that AI are taking over from us is sort of based on an assumption that you can make these binary distinctions, that one is superior in all cases, in all situations, and the other is always inferior in all situations. And that's never the case in biological interactions. And I venture to say it's never the case in computational interactions either. That when you're denied a loan at the bank because some algorithm has decided you don't meet the criteria, that's an instance in which the power dynamics seem to be operating in form of the algorithm. The algorithm in turn is supported by a whole computational media infrastructure. And when the electric bill goes unpaid, that media infrastructure can no longer exist. So in that case, it's the humans who call the shots, particularly the electric company when it shuts off the electricity. So the idea that there is some universal power dynamic is the first thing to question here. Instead, we should think about various and continuing power dynamics that are always shifting and in which no single entity is ever entirely in control. And that includes humans. One of the illusions we have is that in these cognitive assemblages, it's always us who's calling the shots. But as you just mentioned, that's very far from the case. And even in scenarios where humans do have the final decision, as say launch a nuclear missile, well, that's already based on so much information that's been interpreted by computational media. You have to see that decision as not single, but made through innumerable intermediaries. So power is disseminated, decision-making is disseminated, and that's already the case without adding artificial intelligence into the mix. So now you add artificial intelligence. Well, primarily it is humans who design these programs, and they design them for specific purposes. But already we know there are many instances where software is designing software. So the software that designs software is ultimately designed by humans, but humans may not be, certainly are not totally in control of what that software does. So we have to accept the idea that we already live in a world in which decisions are distributed, control is distributed, that we are one actor in a complex adaptive system, which we do not control, and which at best we can influence to go in certain directions at certain times.
Thank you very much for that very thorough answer. And perhaps my last question before we'll open up to to the audiences. In this increasingly technical world of interdependence on the technical and computational media, what is the importance of stories, narratives, and meaning, perhaps, since especially you are a brilliant literary scholar and critique?
Oh, stories are absolutely essential. Stories are one of the ways in which humans create, disseminate, bend, and construct meanings. But I'll just say here that meanings are not to be understood as the sole province of humans, that all life forms are capable of constructing meanings. And here I draw on biosemiotics to talk about how non-human organisms do construct meanings. They construct meanings by interpreting information in contexts in which their behaviors have meanings. So if a bacterium moves toward a food source rather than a toxin, that's a behavior that has a meaning to the bacteria. And the meaning is the continuation of its existence. So as you go up into more and more complex organisms, the meanings become more and more complex. So it's been shown that non-human animals engage in human-like games of competition, of lying, of deception. All of the power dynamics that we see in human societies have been found in non-human animals as well. So meanings are not the exclusive province of humans, but narratives is one of the crucial ways in which for humans meanings are constructed and disseminated. And so therefore they have a kind of enduring power in human society. And the kind of narratives we construct, how we disseminate them, and how we bend them according to the power dynamics at play is a crucial aspect of human sociality.
Thank you very much for that. And I think now we're going to open perhaps the floor to questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you so much, Catherine and Audrey, for the discussion. So this is a perfect moment to transition because we have some questions about meaning that have been submitted. So for people who'd like to submit more questions, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and we'll be collecting them and working through them. So the first question for you both, this is from Fabio, who says, I'm curious about the specific meaning of the word meaning when this term is applied to machine cognition rather than human cognition. Does that entail, so to say, that it relates to the regime of calculations rather than cultural self-reflection?
Okay, well, that's a great question. And to answer that question adequately, I need to refer to some specific form of AI. So let me take the GPTs as examples. How do GPTs construct meaning for themselves as well as for their human interlocutors? Well, there are arguments to say that these texts have no meaning. The stochastic parrots argument articulated by Emily Bender and her collaborators. I understand where that's coming from because lacking an embodied and embedded world, what kind of meaning could these texts have? Well, the way that they're actually constructed is through a series of indexical pointers that create correlations between billions and billions of tokens or word fragments. So these correlations start out on a quite rudimentary basis in a neural net, but they develop into hierarchies of correlations, first relations between words and then relations between relations. And it's from these correlations that the AIs develop the ability to create human equivalent texts and also, in my view, to create meaningful texts. So do they fulfill the requirements for cognitive entities? I think without a doubt, yes, with some significant qualifications. Their environment from which they sense and draw data is entirely a textual universe, also including images. It has no connection with the real world other than through these linguistic tokens. But that said, those linguistic tokens embed a whole world of human perception and knowledge. So embedded in the data that they ingest are all these implications, associations, consequences, and so on that we experience as humans. And as a neural net learns, it acquires those associations, learns to make the correlations and connections between those different associations, and therefore create texts that have meaning for us as humans, but I believe also have meaning for them as cognitive entities.
And if I may jump on that, what about when they're then re-injected, all of these, the meaning that is produced through these texts, and then they are re-injected into our own, common discourses, common human discourses?
Yes, and this is a really interesting question because so far the archive used to train these AIs are almost exclusively human authored texts, but machine authored texts are increasingly entering into that archive. So now you have a situation in which some percentage of those texts are not human authored, but machine authored. And the machine authored texts are going into the pre-training of these AIs along with all of the human texts. And as that percentage grows, which it certainly will grow, you're getting a kind of recursive loop between AIs trained on AI texts. And the result of that, I think, inevitably will be a certain homogenization that will lack the creative spark that humans can inject into this by anticipating something completely new and novel. So I make a distinction here between between knowledge created by connecting two things that were never connected before, which is implicit knowledge that becomes explicit. And AIs are marvelous at this. They can connect all these data points that were never connected before. For example, what is the origin of very rare diseases? Well, an AI would be able to take these isolated incidences through medical history, be able to connect them and to come up with some kind of reasonable explanation of their cause in a way that no human could. That's the space of possibility, connecting points that were never connected before. We have explicit knowledge, which is some proportion of that space of possibility, but then there's implicit knowledge, everything that can be gained that through this sort of making implicit knowledge explicit. But in addition to this space of possibility, there's another kind of creation that I call potentiality. And that so far is the exclusive province of humans. And that's the ability to envision something completely new that has never been thought of before. You think of Einstein's relativity theory as an example of that, an entirely new way to see things. It's not implicit in what's already been known, the way that possibility is. It's a new creation. It's something that was potentially there, but never actualized before. And that's something that AIs at present, in my view, are not able to do. Only humans can do that. So we have the ability to learn a tremendous amount from AIs, but that knowledge comes from the space of possibilities. It will only be humans who can reach into the space of potentiality and articulate something completely new.
If I may jump on that, do you think that this is also, playing devil's advocate again for a few seconds, that this is also maintaining a form of binary, and that there may come a time in the not so distant future where computational media may be able to have this, have access to this potentiality, this intuitive knowledge?
I think that's definitely a possibility. It's not here yet. Neither are conscious computers here yet, but I wouldn't rule that out. The history of computation has been littered with statements like this. Computers will never be able to do X. Well, one after one after one, all of those statements have fallen by the wayside. So I'm not one of those to say computers can never be sentient. Computers can never reach into the space of potentiality, but they will need a completely different kind of neural hardware in order to do that. So I think of something like the synapse chip that's being developed now by DARPA and other tech companies. Well, that's a even more biomorphic chip than present neural nets. And who knows what kind of achievements that can reach when it reaches maturity. And now it's just at the very, very beginning stages. But clearly, this kind of evolutionary trajectory is only going to increase. It's not going to decrease.
Excellent. So the next question is from Francis, who asks, how is Catherine's theory different from Latour's actor network theory?
Oh, what a wonderful question. Well, it's different in so many ways, but let me just focus on one. The distinction that I draw between agents and actors is not one that that Latour wants to draw. So he makes no distinction between technical objects and life forms in terms of their abilities. In fact, he doesn't focus much on cognition at all. He focuses primarily on non-cognitive techniques. So he comes up with very different conclusions than I do. But you know, more recently, in some of his recent work, like Facing Gaia and Down to Earth, he's wanted to draw an equivalence between religion and science that, to me, just doesn't hold. So essentially, he wants to make science on a level playing field with religion in terms of the claims it can make and the robustness of its knowledge. But that's because, in my view, he ignores a crucial difference between scientific methodologies and religious faiths. And that is, as Karl Popper pointed out over a century ago, the ability of science to disconfirm a hypothesis. So religious faiths have no way to systematically disconfirm a statement. If someone says she has seen the face of God, how would you contest that within the ethics of religious faith? You have to take it at face value or else just dismiss it altogether. But science does have a way to disconfirm hypotheses. And in that sense, it offers us a more robust and reliable source of knowledge than religion is about the way the world actually works. So I think science is our most reliable path toward that kind of reliable and robust knowledge. And that's not to say that science is not culturally affected. Of course it is. It's constructed and it's constructed through all the power dynamics and all the social complexities that human societies are develop. So in that way, it's never neutral, it's never objective, but it nevertheless is a pathway to reliability and a kind of robust knowledge that's, I think, stood us in very good stead.
May I jump on that? The status of science and hypotheses. And I'm thinking here of a seminal 2008 article in Wired magazine by Chris Anderson and the death of, you know, what he calls the death of theory and the death of hypotheses. Do you agree with his diagnostic? Do you believe that we are past this stage?
No.
Stage?
No, because that assumes that correlation is enough. In fact, Louisa Moore points this out in her book, Cloud Ethics. She specifically talks about the statement that was said to her by a data scientist, correlation is enough. And essentially, that's Chris Anderson's argument. We don't need causality. If we have enough correlation, you can do away with causality. But in my view, that's nonsense. You can't do away with causality because causality allows you to understand the mechanisms producing those correlations. If all you have are the correlations, then you don't have a profound understanding of what those correlations really mean. And what they really mean depends on understanding how they're produced. And in order to understand how they're produced, you have to have causality. And in fact, I think one of the big advances in contemporary neural nets is the ability to make the leap from correlation to causality. So when GPT-4 was released, 14 researchers from Microsoft were given early access to test its capabilities extensively. and they called their report Sparks of General Artificial Intelligence. So they're not saying that it is a general artificial intelligence, but they're pointing out all the ways in which GPT-4 is an advance over GPT-3 precisely in its ability to make the leap from correlation to causal reasoning. So no way do I think we can do away with causal reasoning. But what Anderson, might have neglected in his glorification of correlation is that actually artificial intelligence entities may be able to go from correlation to causality. So I don't say that correlation can never lead to causality. Yes, if you have enough of it, and if you have enough sophisticated ways to understand correlations, you may be able to make the leap to causality. But will we do without causality? No way.
Thank you.
So Paula asks, while language can be a fantastic crystallization of sedimented experience, when it comes to cognition and particularly to non-human potentials for sentience, are there different types of embodiment that could be embedded within non-biologics, do you think? The ability of large-scale data collection and sensors may be a superior version of embodiment potentially.
Well, one of the real interesting research fronts now is how to connect embodied entities with semiotic entities. Let's call the GPT semiotic entities. They're operating within the world of semiosis. But there are many experiments now to connect LLMs with robots and to find a way to interface the robot's sensory experiences in the world with the awesome linguistic capabilities of LLMs. And so far, something like the SayCan project at Microsoft is still very rudimentary. So, it's almost painful to watch the Microsoft videos of the SayCan robot trying to interact with the LLM because it's the whole project involving these enormous technological, infrastructures is how do you get a robot to linguistically understand the sentence or understand that a spill on a countertop needs to be wiped off with a sponge. Well, that's something that any child could do in a minute. So it's at that level of achievement. But clearly, the next big research front is going to be to make precisely this connection between embodied experience and linguistic capabilities. And, being aware of all the pronouncements, computer can't do X, that fallen by the wayside, I'm not prepared to say this will never happen. I think it's already happening. And even though it's at a very primitive level now, who knows what future achievements may be possible in this realm.
So I think I'll pose these two questions together because they're both about cognition. Nika asks, does characterizing AI as a cognition undermine your argument about bacteria as cognitive agents? And Bunmi asks, isn't AI a product of human cognition?
Well, does it undermine saying that bacteria are cognitive? No, because the 5 criteria that I outline for cognition are be able to sense information from an environment, be able to interpret information from an environment, be able to have a flexible response to that interpretation, be able to anticipate and be able to learn. It's been shown that bacteria have these cognitive capabilities. In fact, gene editing relies on bacterial cognition to recognize a viral DNA fragment, for example. But the same criteria can be applied to artificial intelligence, with some modifications. So the principal modification is that bacteria are operating in an environment of the natural world. Artificial intelligence is operating in an artificially constructed environment. And that's a huge difference, which has many, many significant implications. But given that the environment for the AI is entirely artificially constructed, yes, it senses information from that environment, it interprets information, it makes a response, it anticipates consequences, and it learns. So it has the same capabilities in a completely different register. And the main difference is what constitutes the environment, as well, of course, all the technical infrastructures that makes those responses possible. But in that sense, and given that definition of cognition, there's no question that AIs are cognitive entities, no less than bacteria are cognitive entities. And then the second question, remind me what that was?
Isn't AI a product of human cognition?
Yes, of course it is. Absolutely it is. It's completely a product of human cognition. But I'm not sure what the questioner wanted to imply by that.
Well, they're not able to respond immediately. So I think we'll move on, and we have time just for one last question. In fact, I'm going to put these two questions together again because they're both about ethics. So Kanad asks, do you see AI coming within the moral circle in the foreseeable future? Or more precisely, is there anything you would look for to determine if they are moral actors? Do they present special challenges vis-a-vis animals? And Ian also asks, does Katherine consider AI entities to be actors potentially having moral rights and responsibilities in the same way that we commonly believe humans do?
Yeah, those are two different questions. Are AIs moral actors? Well, I'm not sure how you would define a moral actor, but the AI companies are intensely aware of all of the ethical questions involved by using an AI. Questions of bias, for example, loom very large. Can these AI be used to facilitate immoral and unethical acts? And they've created various kinds of guardrails to guard against the most obvious abuses, but given human ingenuity, I'm sure those guardrails can be subverted in various kinds of ways. So these are very powerful technologies, and I'm sure that there are instances in which they can be subverted and used for evil purposes. That's not even touching on all the ethical questions involved in the way that institutions use AIs, for example. Their questions of bias loom very large, questions of equity and justice loom very large, and so forth. So now remind me of the second question.
The second question was, does Katherine consider AI entities to be actors potentially having moral rights and responsibilities in the same way that we commonly believe humans do?
Yeah, so this is somewhat arbitrary and it's personal view, but in my view, in order for AIs to have moral rights and obligations, they have to be able to develop consciousness. Will that happen? It almost certainly is not the case now. I know of no conscious AI entity, but could it be possible in the future? Yes, I think it could be. And if you have an AI that is conscious, that is awareness of itself as a self acting in the world, then I believe we will have to, as a human society, seriously consider the question of the ethical rights and obligations we have toward this conscious entity. So that's my view of the matter, that it's not here now, but I think it definitely could be here in the future.